Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the hardcore, pure, no compromise libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day by the Future of Freedom Foundation, where you can find us online at fff.org. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who writes an article that we publish every Monday in our FFF Daily that is free for the asking by subscription. Richard, good to see you again. Welcome back.
It's great to be back and with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, well, we've had another 2 episodes of terrorist attacks or shootings or truck killings. You got one in New York where a guy took a truck and bashed down a bunch of people, killing many of them they were jogging or just walking down a path in New York. Then yesterday you had another mass killing in Texas where a shooter walked into a church and killed, 26 people. I mean, it's just, to me, Richard, another characteristic of just the violence that afflicts American society, and hardly anyone in the mainstream press really tries to get at the root of the violence. I mean, instead, we hear the same typical calls, we need gun control. And I guess in New York, they would call for truck control. I mean, I don't know how else you would control that type of murder of people. But it's the same song and dance. Nobody wants to talk about the root cause of violence in America. And the knee-jerk response is, hey, well, let's have gun control. Well, let's keep in mind that in Texas, I would assume that just like here in Virginia, a church is a gun-free zone, mandatory gun-free zone, where the law prohibits people from carrying guns into churches in Texas. Now, Texas is a concealed carry state, just like it is here in Virginia. But here in Virginia, it's illegal to carry into churches. And I wrote, a couple of years ago, I said, don't be surprised to see more of these shootings in churches, because most people are law-abiding, including those that conceal carry. And they comply with the law. The law prohibits them from carrying guns into churches. They're going to obey the law. But as we have long pointed out, Richard, since the very beginning of this foundation 28 years ago, people who are going to commit murder do not obey gun control laws. I mean, I don't know what it'll take for that to sink into people. That it's just a fact of life, that if you're not going to give a hoot about a murder law, you're not going to give a hoot about some misdemeanor or even a felony law that prohibits you from carrying the gun that you're going to use to kill people into a church. I do find it interesting and ironic that what really diminished the number of people that were killed in Texas was a private citizen who took out his gun and started firing at the guy and may have even hit him. It's not clear as to what killed him. He's now dead. And then, it's the same principle in New York. In Texas, the motive isn't clear yet. And just as it isn't like in Las Vegas with that mass killing. In New York, it appears to be fairly clear. The guy had a bunch of Islamic type literature, and he says God is great before he commits his mayhem. But then to go down to the root of it, I really think it's what I've been saying for the last couple of years. I think it's characteristic of our foreign policy that when you've got a government that's engaged in forever war, killing people on a constant basis overseas, with no regard to who they're killing and whatever, that is going to ultimately seep into the consciousness and the subconscious of the American people. So that while you have these wackos in every society, when you have a warfare state society that's constantly killing people overseas, showing no regard for human life at all, that ultimately is going to cause the wacko to go off the deep end. And the example of the counterexample is Switzerland. I mean, you don't see these acts of mass violence in Switzerland. There, everybody's armed to the teeth, and yet you don't see it. Instead, you just see it here in the United States. What do you think?
Well, I should point out one thing is that you were saying that, for example, in Virginia and other places, it is against the law to bring firearms into a church. That's not true everywhere. Maybe the viewers and listeners will remember from a couple of or so years ago, that tragic similar event here in Charleston, South Carolina, when this self-proclaimed white racist roofer, this young man, went into a black church in Old Charleston area and proceeded to kill 9 people and wound others. I was talking to some people who attend churches, especially black churches, here in the greater Charleston area. And they tell me that now there are armed guards at many church services on Sunday. Sometimes they'll ask the local police to have a patrol car or a patrolman near the location of the church. But they also told me that retired military personnel who belong to their church and who have gun permits will often stand guard over the facility to make sure that something like happened here before doesn't happen again. That's a terrible thing. I mean, it's not even an issue of making gun ownership and bringing them into churches illegal. I mean, it's a tragic social situation where people at a place of worship, where you're supposed to have a fellowship and an environment of peace and reflection on the greater transcendental issues that matter to you, that you should have to be concerned and call upon people to carry firearms. That says something about the situation and indeed, unfortunately, the psychology of the country. In the wider issue, I think that there's a whole variety of dimensions to this that you've drawn on. One is that when there is a militant and militaristic state, historically, it is inevitable that a large portion of the population circulate through the military. And not only circulating through the military in those cases where there's conscription or a volunteer force of a large number, but a circumstance in which those who serve in the military over several generations or over a sequence of wars, as the United States has been fighting now for over 15 years, you have an entire subgroup of the population who have been put into the situation continuously in several rotations into countries like Afghanistan or Iraq, in which they have psychologically been harmed. There's a lot of talk about this, that people come back with mental problems, they can't adjust to peaceful society, the anxiety, the paranoia of being under life-threatening fire, and the intensity of those circumstances. But I think that particularly in the face of great wars, such as the First World War, the 100th anniversary of which we're now going through, and the Second World War, it creates a desensitizing to violence, a devaluating on the part of some people who go through those experiences of a disrespect and a disregard for the value of life. It psychologically makes you think about how you should treat people, can treat people, and will treat people somewhat differently. Now, again, I want to emphasize that everything that I've said affects many people, but a small handful of them can be affected in this way. Now, this event in Texas is very recent. Very little has been released as information about either the victims or the perpetrator, who, as you pointed out, is dead. But one bit of information that I saw yesterday is that he did serve in the armed forces for a period of time. So that's one person who would have been pulled into this. Then there's the other element of violence, and this concerns more the situation in New York City, where the truck driver drove through downtown Manhattan, not far from where used to stand the World Trade Towers, and proceed to crash into pedestrians and bicyclists along the street, killing, as I recall, 8 or 9 and injuring many more. And jumping out of the truck and, according to the reports, shouting in Arabic, "God is great," and in his computer they found literature showing his attachment psychologically, theologically, ideologically to the Islamic State. This has been intensified. There's always going to be crazy people who are motivated by ideology, radical, intolerant, dogmatic theology, to view people of other beliefs, faiths, and ideas as enemies. But this has been intensified. It has been exacerbated. It has created a magnet pulling people by the fact that the wars that the United States has undertaken in the Middle East are viewed by many Muslims, whether correctly or incorrectly, as an attack on the faith itself by the United States, an undermining and a depreciation of the Muslim and Arabic culture and traditions. This arrogance of the United States to try to set their house right, as the Americans believe that house should be redesigned, and a diminishment and a disrespect and a disregard of what they view as the cradle for their religious faith. Now that just creates like a magnet to draw people who have their own internal weaknesses, complexes, problems, to become attached to a cause like this, act violently. And it's not just theological, if I can just elaborate on the commonalities of this thing, Jacob. In the 1940s and 50s, when people who had served as members of the Communist Party in the United States, or as fellow travelers who participated in the spying activities, sort of gave up the ghost, the scales fell from their eyes, and they became, quote, anti-communist, and then wrote books about their experiences. I'm thinking like someone like Elizabeth Bentley, who wrote one of these earlier exposés in the late 1940s, having been a communist. What you find here is the same things. A person who's sort of lost, who has no sense of direct or meaning for their life, often is awkward and finds it difficult to socialize and form networks of friendships or extended family, and they're looking for a cause, a purpose, a goal, a meaning, and they latch on to something. These anti-communists would say what communism gave them was a vision of a purpose, a structure, a sense of how it all fits together, what it means, and where it's going. Now that was secular theology. Here we have the United States sort of stirring the pot and making it easier for the Islamic nuts and crazies in the Middle East. And you'll notice I said Islamic nuts and crazies. I did not say all believers of the faith of Islam, but the theological totalitarians among them. They draw these people. They're lost. They have no purpose. That they feel alienated. This is the true faith, like communism was for that earlier generation of Americans. This gives meaning and direction to your life. There's good and there's evil. There's God and the devil, Satan. And who is the Satan who's disrupting things, violating things, preventing a heaven on earth? Well, that was the appeal for communists drawn to Stalin's Russia. Oh, making paradise and the evil capitalist West. Oh, this is the true faith, Islam, as defined by the theology of these theological totalitarians. And the enemy is America, and we must now attack the enemy in his home country. The same way the communists would spy in the United States to send information over to Stalin. To the extent that the America involves itself in these interventions abroad, it makes it easier for the radicals over there to be able to attract Americans and Europeans and others who are converted to the faith, the same way others were converted to Marxism, to become tools of this violent intrigue and murder and terror. So America's place in the world as a policeman of the world, intervener around the world, as arrogant presumptor to impose a definition of how the world should be shaped and what it should be like, and of course America at the top of the world, has exacerbated and brought out, in a sense, the worst in a handful of people that has brought this tragedy to the rest of us.
Yeah, you brought up some interesting points, especially on the warfare state and the terrorist blowback from that, and then what I was referring to as the dysfunctionality in American society that results from this way of life. I mean, this is what we've been saying even before 9/11, Richard, that terrorist blowback, retaliation, is a necessary consequence of U.S. foreign policy, of interventionism. I mean, when you're abroad killing people, it's theoretically possible that people will just continue to be killed, to submit to the U.S. will and to their dictates, but it's unlikely. And ultimately, people get angry when you bomb their wedding parties, their brides, the flower girls at these weddings, when you're just bombing indiscriminately, when you're killing so-called terrorists. People are going to retaliate. And it's what we've said from the very beginning, is that this is a cost of U.S. interventionism. Now, the interesting part of the interventionism from a dysfunctional aspect is how the American people have bought into this notion that the terrorists just hate us for our freedom and values. And this is the thing that we've been saying ever since 9/11. And you recall, because you were writing for us at that time, and we were addressing this issue, all the hate mail that was coming in to us for daring to suggest that the U.S. government was responsible for generating this anger and this rage in people overseas as well as here at home who subscribe to the Muslim faith. We kept pointing out it has nothing to do with hatred for America's freedom and values. It has everything to do with U.S. interventionism. So if people believe in interventionism, if they favor it, they simply have to accept the fact that there is a cost, and that cost is terrorist blowback. And then, of course, the subsequent cost is the destruction of our own liberties, because now the government has to keep us safe from these terrorists that it itself has generated with its interventionism, and that's how we end up with this giant national security state, where the government's spying on us, keeping track of our emails, recording our telephone calls, and doing all sorts of things in the name of keeping us safe. And as you point out, you've got a multitude of people that have served in the military now as part of this warfare state. And a lot of them are convinced that they're just protecting our rights and freedoms. Well, that's just nonsense. It's just a lie. America is living the life of the lie. And you see it in churches across America where ministers tell their congregation, oh, let us pray for the troops because they're defending our rights and freedoms overseas. Well, let me just state flatly, that's a lie. There is no place around the world where anybody is threatening the rights and freedoms of the American people. There is no threat of an invasion. There is no threat of an occupation. Those are things the U.S. government is doing in other countries. It is invading. It is occupying. It is bombing. It is assassinating. It is kidnapping. And it's all happening over there. So there's no such thing as the troops defending our rights and freedoms. But when you've got so many soldiers believing this lie for the lie and killing people based on a lie, I agree with you. I think it's going to affect ultimately some of these people, not all of them, but it affects people on the margin. And so they've been trained to kill. They've been trained to believe that anybody they kill deserves to be killed. And they come back home and something goes off kilter. So this guy here, I read that he had been forcibly ejected from the military, a dishonorable discharge. He had been convicted of attacking his wife and children. How can one not wonder whether this is a consequence of killing people overseas that the man had no right to kill at all, who were never attacking the United States? And then there's just that person in society who's just a little crazy, a little wacko. You recall in the 50s, in my hometown, there was that kind of person. He'd walk around town. I forget what they called him. They had a special nickname for him. But he'd go fluttering around town, like really acting really weird. But he wouldn't hurt anybody. There was no need to commit him to an insane asylum or anything like that, because he never initiated any violence. But I think what happens over time when you've got a warfare state society where the government's just killing people day in and day out, and even though the media protects us from this, doesn't show photographs of the dead or the body parts from the bombings, I think it ultimately seeps into the people, where there's less tolerance for opposing views. You see that in college campuses. People are uncivil to each other. Tempers flare much easier. And then you've got these people at the margin that suddenly they seem to just explode and into acts of violence, like the guy in Las Vegas or now this guy in Texas, where there doesn't seem to be a motive. But if there is a motive, it oftentimes is because of anger of what the U.S. government's doing overseas. And I think this is what people have to recognize, and is that if you want to live in this dysfunctional society, keep things as they are. Embrace the interventionism, embrace the warfare trade, embrace the militarism, but don't be surprised when you see the consequences that flow from this way of life. And of course, the other side of this whole thing is the violence that's associated with the drug war. I mean, people hardly ever address that. Instead, they immediately go over to the idea of, oh, we need gun control, rather than recognize that it is government, interventionism abroad, drug war at home, that is the root cause of much of this violence.
I think we also have to not forget the extent to which there is a huge propaganda machine. I'm not saying instructions coming out of Washington, D.C. per se, but a mindset that permeates popular culture. Anyone who watches television can easily be sucked into this. The things I'm referring to is that perhaps some of the viewers or listeners are familiar with a television show that is now in season 3 or season 4 called Madam Secretary. She is the Secretary of State, and her husband is an operative who works in the CIA, doing various intrigues and subterfuge in various places. And the president, the character who plays the president, is someone who previously was the head of the CIA and now is the president of the United States. Now, what's important here is that you watch episode after episode each week, and what is the imagery that is created? America is there to set the world right. America is concerned with illegal human trafficking. America is interested in diminishing the harm to people in violations of human rights in country X, Y, and Z. America is there to prevent war by acting as an arbitrator between countries A and B who are in some type of a threat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the entire imagery is that here's the Secretary of State and her staff, and they're just there to serve the world through America, because America stands for the good, the just, the right, the moral agent in a world that suffers from a deep imperfection of corruption, immorality, and violence. And if not for American leadership to right these wrongs, then who? And then, of course, you have the action shows on television, like SEALs, in which you follow these teams of trained and qualified but expert interveners and assassins and killers. And they're doing their own good things. So sometimes one will have a wonder whether this is right or good, but as the military always tells you, the mission comes first, and you can have confidence in the mission because America is there to do good everywhere around the globe. Now, in a Hollywood that constantly says that it's anti-establishment, that it's critical of gung-ho nationalistic conservatism, etc., they produce these shows, and millions of Americans watch them. Okay, you don't stay on for 3, 4, 5, 6 seasons unless millions of viewers are watching the show every week, right? Because of the ratings and the advertising revenue. This is just sucking most people in to believe, what has America done wrong in the world? Why do they hate us? Why are they opposing us? And then, of course, that combined with the official script of world events out of Washington itself, across many administrations, regardless of party. You know, the Democrats rail against Bush and now Trump, but and their militarism, their nationalism, their gung-hoism. We had 8 years of Obama, and Obama oversaw a continuation of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, who supported the intervention to topple Gaddafi in Libya and to bring chaos to that country, and who became the drone war king of America, in that he initiated this vast network of attacks through drones. So you don't have to put Americans into harm's way, but we're here in a fight in which there's a wonderful morality in killing people, but not risking American lives in the process of doing so. And all of these types of episodes that you were referring to a few moments ago, where wedding parties have been, the collateral damage of some drone attack in Yemen or some other place in the Middle East and so on. All of this is on Obama's watch. He had a similar disregard and contempt and arrogance in the use of American power around the world as the progressives and the left tries to tartar and feather George W. Bush and now Trump. It's a mindset of those who gain power in Washington and a vision of the role of America. It's an ideology that permeates the society and makes it very difficult for people to listen to someone such as you were suggesting your response to this worldview a few moments ago of turn away the screen and see who's pulling the levers. Don't look behind the screen. It's a screen like in the Wizard of Oz, right? You're not supposed to know who the Wizard of Oz is. But the point is that if you pull down away the screen, you realize that it is mortal men who have this arrogance and presumption of being social engineers and redesigners of the world according their, whether it's Republican or Democrat, more conservative, more liberal conceptions of how to remake the world in their image of an ideologically good and just society. And they're willing to use force to do so. And then that becomes part of the American persona. It's very difficult for an American to escape from the power and the psychology of this through this vast formal and informal, such as in these Hollywood shows, propaganda machine that permeates our conception of what our country is about, which is a deeply distorted and twisted one. If one were to step back and look at the United States with the same dispassion and objectivity that we look at often foreign leaders in their countries, and to say, look at the corruption, look at the violence, look at the hypocrisy, look at the cruelty, look at the violation of rights. If we could step back and look outside of ourselves and see ourselves, we would see most of the same characteristics that we point a finger at when we look at other countries.
Yeah, you raised two very interesting points: the hubris of the planner, and then the indoctrination of the citizen to support all this thing. I mean, it really shows the integration of the welfare state and the warfare state from the standpoint of the planner. He's got what Hayek calls the fatal conceit. And conservatives seem to recognize this in terms of central planning domestically, that you've got the central planner saying, I know what's best. I can make things right for everyone. I can force everyone to be good with mandatory charity like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies. I can bring prosperity. And of course, it's been an absolute disaster. But what conservatives can't see is that the same mindset applies in foreign affairs to the warfare state. All they're doing is taking that same mindset that they've applied to the welfare state internationally. We know what's best for the people of Iraq. We know what's best for the people of Afghanistan. And when we invade and when we attack and they resist us, we will kill them because we know what's in their best interest when they don't. And then you've got the indoctrinee. I mean, I find it interesting that Americans look at North Koreans and they say, God, those poor people, they're just so indoctrinated. But yet here, it's no different. It starts in the first grade. And not only in the public schools, I mean, that's the main place it starts, but also in the government licensed private schools, because they have to answer to the government too for fear of losing their license. So they pledge allegiance and they're taught the official version of events. For example, the United States is never the aggressor, not even when it was trying to assassinate Cuba's president, when it invaded Cuba, a country and a president that never attacked the United States. And people just honestly take the position, oh, the CIA is good because it was trying to help the Cuban people when it attacked at the Bay of Pigs and when it tried to assassinate a man who had never done anything against the United States. So the indoctrination is complete at both ends, their end as well as this end. And it's really a matter of how do you break through that. I mean, to me, it's hopeful because I was one of the indoctrinees, Richard. I believed in all this junk, welfare state and warfare state, growing up as a kid. It never occurred to me that I didn't live in a free society. And then all of a sudden I discovered libertarianism and all the scales started dropping and I started realizing this is a bunch of bull. that this is the root cause of the dysfunctionality of American society. The welfare state on one side and the warfare state, which is not freedom. It is the opposite of freedom. The framers certainly didn't bring into existence a perfectly free society. We know that with slavery and with tariffs and a multiplicity of lesser violations. But we know one thing: they didn't bring into existence a welfare state. They didn't bring into existence a warfare state. And I think what we need to do is to go back to those founding principles and build on them and start thinking in terms of not trying to tinker at the edges, but really building a free society, which necessarily entails getting rid of the fatal conceit of government planners by taking away their toys. And those toys are the welfare state way of life and the warfare national security state way of life.
Yeah, I think that another indication of this is that how easily we become desensitized to the anti-terror mentality, psychology, and an institutional setting that American involvement abroad brings back to us as well. If you see old documentary films of Washington, D.C. during the Second World War, and you see people going into the Capitol building, for example, yes, it's wartime, and there were a few other military sentries standing guard, at the base of the steps leading into the Capitol building, et cetera, but there were no barricades. There were no 3 layers of security checks to get into the Capitol building. There were none of these barricades around the streets, or now in New York they're putting up these barricades to separate the street from where the bicycle corridor is for people to jog or ride their bike. This has all come back at us because of the enemies and the violence that our own interventions abroad have rebounded to us. And it's not just now our life is more difficult, more inconvenient. Think of the security checks that we have to go through at airports. All I ask is any viewer or listener to watch an old movie from, let's say, the 1950s or even the early 60s, in which there's an airport scene. There's no metal detector, there's no x-ray scanner. Some guy comes to the counter to pick up his check and he's smoking a cigar, and you can and family friends can walk someone to the gate to wish them off or to meet them when the plane arrived. And you'd be able to stand on the observation deck on top of the building, and through a telescope, with a quarter in it, you could look at the planes and the people landed. All of that is gone. Those liberties are gone, and it's all because we've become so involved in this militarism and this war abroad that the reactions of others against our intervention requires us to give up so much of our liberties and our conveniences of everyday life, and people nonchalantly take it for granted. What, you mean these barricades along the street or in front of buildings or 3 layers of security checks? You mean that hasn't been there since George Washington took the first oath of office to be president? Gee, I never realized that. This is the dilemma we're in. And in this sense, these little elements of us make us less free, less open, less adaptable to just enjoying being a person in what is supposed to be a free society. And all of these are reflections and aspects of this global policeman mentality and practice that has forced us into this garrison state mentality, the siege state mentality, which we then say, I'm shocked. We've had to do this and I don't understand why. There are reasons behind it, and it's because of our own actions that have come back at us.
Yeah, and it's not just government institutions. I mean, I go to the Washington Nationals baseball games, and now they've got metal detectors there that everybody has to walk through. And it's all across the country. And, of course, in the baseball games, you've got military generals there singing the Star-Spangled Banner, and everybody being exhorted to stand up and praise the troops for defending our rights and freedoms. I mean, the life of the lie and the life of militarism has infected practically every part of our society. And let me wrap it up by saying, Richard, that everybody's got a right to defend himself, and that there's that old saying that when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns, and we might add that only the government will have guns as well. But the people who want to commit mayhem are going to do it. and they by enacting gun control, they're depriving people of the right to defend themselves. Those people in New York that were walking down that path were not permitted to have a concealed carry or to carry a weapon with them. I don't know what the law is in Texas. You've got a good point. Some states don't require people to leave their guns outside of churches. I don't know what the situation is, but the point is that the law should not prohibit people from having the natural God-given right of defending themselves from people who don't give a hoot about gun control laws, whether it's for one reason or another. So on that note, Richard, we're out of time. We'll wrap it up for the day, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and again, I want to thank our viewers and listeners for spending a little bit of their time with us.
Yeah, thank you all, and thank you also for the comments that you put under our videos. We read them all. We try to respond to them all. We appreciate your feedback. If you want to know more about the Future of Freedom Foundation, come to fff.org. All of our articles are there, including Richard's weekly article, my daily blog, and we look forward to having you subscribe to our FFF Daily or to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. So thanks for tuning in, and Richard, I'll see you next week.
Till next time.